is neither clickbait nor disingenuous. The subject matter of this video is truth and lies, honesty against deceit. In fact, this is taken from a video that I did some time ago, which in fact was quite an in-depth video talking about the nature of honesty as against deceit and various studies and what those studies show with the people that are honest or dishonest. But also, being honest about it, I wanted to bring this video back as a sort of a repost because I spent a lot of time on this video and it didn't get too many views compared to some others. So I hope you enjoy it. So let me know in the comments what you think of the video and how it might resonate with the events of your life. Enjoy. Lots of people lie, yet at their core, everybody knows that it's wrong. Most people realize there's a victim when they lie, and yet many people choose to do it anyway. Research shows that the more people lie, the more they are likely to lie, and the more significant lies they are likely to tell. And so the balance between truth and lies is fundamental to all human interaction, and of course is at the very heart of the justice system. The court system is there to find the real truth and to eliminate lies or expose lies, mistruths, and at its very worst, fraud. Fraud is just another form of a lie, which can be understood to be a dishonest action which is intended to cause loss to another or for false benefit of the person committing the fraud, all of which is, of course, dishonest. And so therefore there is a wide range of separate offences which are considered to be dishonest offences. And these dishonesty offences are taken in a slightly different category than many other offences. For example, the offence of assault, whereby perhaps somebody gets punched in the face. There's nothing inherently dishonest about punching somebody in the face, but it's still wrong. However, perhaps as to when challenged as to why this person punched somebody in the face, the response ultimately will either be the truth or it will be false, some form of a lie. And this again is something that the court will need to pick through and determine the truth as against the lies. So let's look at lies and truthfulness versus dishonesty as a whole. There's a famous behavioral psychologist called Dan Ariely, and one thing he says is that the dangerous thing about lying is that people don't understand how that act changes us. And this, as I said, is because that the research shows that the more people lie, the more they are likely to lie again, and the more significant those lies are going to become. Psychologists have recorded and documented children lying as early as 2 years old, and some even consider it to be a developmental milestone in a child's development, much like crawling, walking and talking. And this is because the act of lying requires a sophisticated level of planning, understanding of a situation, why a lie might be necessary, and what one might achieve with a lie. It also requires the ability to see something from another individual's perspective and how this lie might change the situation for the person's benefit. And this is ultimately the heart of a lie, the benefit. Someone is going to lie about something if there is some kind of benefit, either to themselves or even perhaps to another party. You might well have been in the situation where somebody has asked you whether they like their new hairstyle or their new handbag, their new suit or their new car, or whether their food was up to standard. And your answers are going to have an effect on that person. So sometimes the lie may not be engaged with such malice, planning and cunning, but it might be for the benefit of somebody else. But the problem here is that a small lie can grow into a bigger lie, because research shows that the more lies a person tells, the easier they become to tell. Joshua Green, a cognitive neuroscientist at Harvard, said that for most people, lying takes a significant amount of work. He conducted a study where he gave participants the opportunity to deceive in return for monetary gain, but all the while monitoring them with an MRI machine. The machine was going to examine their brain whilst they were conducting this experiment and map the blood flow to various parts of the brain to examine what happens to a brain when someone is either telling the truth or being deceitful. Sure enough, different parts of the brain fired up when people were telling the truth or telling a lie, indicating that there was this decision process going on as to whether or not to tell the truth or whether or not to be deceitful in exchange for the monetary gain. The follow-up research suggested that for those people who had a more active reward center of the brain were much more likely to lie. In other words, there was a connection between the reward and being dishonest. But all the while, O'Reilly says, is that we are all our own judges of our own honesty. He also said that as a society, we need to understand that if we don't punish someone when they are lying, we are simply increasing the likelihood that it's going to happen again. This was backed up by a study in 2016 in the journal Natural Neuroscience. This showed that when people initially said something untrue, there was a flurry of activity in the amygdala. This is a crucial part of the brain that controls fear, anxiety, guilt, and essentially the fight and flight response. But the problem was that the more people would lie, this activity would decrease, particularly if they were given the opportunity of gaining something whilst deceiving someone else. So the more lies they told, the easier it became. But worse still, when there were no consequences for their dishonesty, their lies became even more sensational. So for me, when a case comes to court, there are essentially two categories of cases. One where there is an element of dishonesty within the case, and another simply where parties disagree as to liability. And the distinction is important because in one case, where the court has to determine whether someone is telling the truth or not, there needs to be a fundamental finding of fact by the court as to whether or not that person is telling the truth. In a criminal sense, at least in a Crown Court trial, the jury will make a finding of fact and judges make findings and rulings on law. In civil cases, of course, it's going to be the judge that makes a finding of fact, but ultimately needs to decide whether a party is telling the truth or is simply being dishonest. One of the questions I often get in response to my videos is, what does the court do when it finds that someone has been dishonest? Well, it's not always as clear-cut as that. Let's say that there's a dispute between two parties as to whether a contract was formed or not. And let's say one party, the defendant, is outright denying any liability to the contract, saying that they never entered the contract in the first place. The claimant offers up evidence to show that there was a contract. In other words, there was an offer, there was acceptance of that offer by the defendant, and the contract exhibited some kind of consideration, meeting the essential requirements of a contract, and the terms were sufficiently clear, and the claimant says the defendant accepted those terms. The defendant, however, says that there was no such contract, there was no such acceptance, perhaps even denying all communication with the claimant at all. In this case, the court has no option but to consider the evidence. As you often hear me say in these videos, it all comes down to the evidence. The court is going to have to consider the evidence that's been submitted by the claimant, and to its contrary, any evidence that may be submitted by the defendant. And the case is simply this. The court will consider any documentary evidence that's been put forward. It will consider any live evidence that it's heard from witnesses from either party, and either side will have an opportunity to cross-examine each other's witnesses and put their evidence under scrutiny and test its reliability, credibility, and consistency. And all of these factors are essential because the court ultimately needs to make a finding of fact as to which party is telling the truth. In the civil courts, this is on the balance of probabilities. In other words, it's more likely than not. In the criminal sense, of course, it is beyond a reasonable doubt, or as it is explained to the jury these days, that the jury must be sure of the finding that they are making. But all of which based on evidence, and the evidence can demonstrate what really happened. So how then does that play with some of the offences of dishonesty, such as theft? Now, the legal test for dishonesty in offences such as theft and other dishonesty offences was redefined somewhat after being in place for many years. Initially, there was a test as to whether the defendant, him or herself, believed that those actions were honest, in addition to whether other members of society felt that those actions were dishonest. So after many years of being in place, that test originally set in Crown against Ghosh in 1982 was somewhat redefined in the case of Ivy and Genting casinos in 2017. The Supreme Court ultimately said that there were serious problems with the test in gauche, in a jury determining whether or not the defendant felt that those actions were dishonest. The Supreme Court said that the law should not excuse those that make a mistake about the modern standards of honesty that as a society we should accept, and that the purpose of the criminal law was to set an acceptable standard of behaviour. So taking this in consideration with the studies, i.e. O'Reilly's studies saying that if dishonesty is not punished, then it's only going to get worse. This new case and new test in Ivy and Genting casinos essentially now measures an individual's level of honesty as against that which is and should be accepted by us as a society. So ultimately where we now stand is that a defendant facing trial for what he or she believes to be perfectly honest and an acceptable level of behaviour may well be facing a criminal sanction and even imprisonment if a jury, by way of an objective, that is, an ordinary, reasonable member of society's point of view, considers that behaviour to be dishonest. So the next time you become frustrated with a child, friend, family member or acquaintance for being dishonest, perhaps you might remember this video and that you are actually doing them a favour by punishing that behaviour. Because ultimately one lie really does lead to another, and a small lie leads to a bigger lie, to a bigger lie and a bigger lie. And ultimately that person now is going to be judged by the objective standards of society, irrespective of their own personal views on whether their actions are dishonest. So let me know in the comments if you think little white lies are acceptable, whether you've told any lies today and whether there are any lies that you stand by, or whether perhaps this has made you reassess and reevaluate your own personal test for dishonesty. In the meantime, if you enjoy the content on my channel, please hit subscribe and the bell icon, because that tells YouTube that you like this content and you'd like to see it in your feed. And remember, stay humble and subscribe.